All right, coming to Acts 19, verse 1 then. Now, after these things had been accomplished, Paul resolved in the Spirit to go through Macedonia and Achaia, and then to go to Jerusalem. He said, after I've gone there, I must also see Rome. So he sent two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia, while he himself stayed for some time longer in Asia. About that time, no little disturbance broke out concerning the way. A man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the artisans. These he gathered together with the workers of the same trade and said, Men, you know we get our wealth from this business. You also see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost the whole of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and drawn away a considerable number of people by saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be scorned, and she will be deprived of her majesty that brought all Asia and the world to worship her. When they heard this, they were enraged and shouted, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! The city was filled with confusion, and people rushed together to the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's travel companions. Paul wished to go into the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some officials of the province of Asia who were friendly to him sent him a message urging him not to venture into the theater. Meanwhile, some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Some of the crowd gave instructions to Alexander, whom the Jews had pushed forward, and Alexander motioned for silence and tried to make a defense before the people. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours, all of them shouted in unison, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! But when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, Citizens of Ephesus, who is there that does not know that the city of the Ephesians is the temple keeper of the great Artemis and of the statue that fell from heaven? Since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. You've brought these men here who are neither temple robbers nor blasphemers of our God. Them have a company, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges there against one another. If there is anything further you want to know, it must be settled in the regular assembly, for we are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there's no cause we can give to justify this commotion. When he had said this, he dismissed the assembly. So here we have the rather well-known, famous incident of the riot in Ephesus that more or less punctuates Paul's time of ministry there in the city of Ephesus. So let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll take a look at this. Father, we are again grateful that you give us, out of your abundant mercy, this opportunity to gather here. We pray that through the presence of your Spirit, you would guide our minds and our hearts to a proper appraisal and understanding of this text. And as a result of that, that we would each be encouraged in our faith in such a way that we would lift up and honor the name of Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Verse 1 then. Now after these things have been accomplished, Paul resolved in the Spirit to go through Macedonia and Achaia, and then to go on to Jerusalem. If you've been in the class for a while, you know that in a sense what he's doing on his third journey is something of a replication of the second journey. In his second journey, he traveled across the breadth of Turkey, as we would call it today. He was inclined in his second journey to go to Ephesus, or at least to go to Asia. And Luke remarks that the Holy Spirit would not let him. He thought about going north, but he wasn't allowed to do that. And the only direction left really was to go west, which he did across the Hellespont there that separates Asia from Europe. He crossed the Aegean over into Macedonia. And we had that whole description of the Macedonian call, and he visits Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea and so on, and goes down the Greek peninsula. This third journey, he takes basically the same route. Again, he goes overland across Turkey. And once again, he wants to go to Ephesus, but this time he does so. And so this third journey, he's here in Ephesus. He's been there now for about 2 years, as we've seen before. He's had a remarkable success, apparently, in his ministry, and now he's inclined to leave and continue this really a repetition of what he did on his second journey, going back north to the city of Troas, which we'll find him there next week, and then from there over to Macedonia and visiting those churches down through the Greek peninsula once again. So it's essentially the same journey that he took before. It says here he resolved in the Spirit to go through Macedonia, which we would take to mean that he resolved this, he formed this kind of firm intention in prayer and thoughtful reflection, etc., with those who were with him. And then after that, he wanted to go on to Jerusalem. This is probably the moment. Last week I gave you the homework assignment to read 1 Corinthians, and I know you all did that. I'm going to quiz you at the end on what you found there. But anyway, you read that, and you probably noticed that this really fits well with the chronology that we find here in the book of Acts. He's going to go to Macedonia, revisiting churches that were established on his second journey. From there, he'll go down and visit the church in Corinth and possibly even pass through Athens once again. And then we read that he wanted to go to Rome. In the Mediterranean, of course, we've got the Greek peninsula, and then further west, the Italian peninsula. And it's there, Rome was the center of the world in that ancient culture. Paul always wanted to go to the center of things. He wanted to go to the big city. He wanted to go to the place where he'd get the most bang for the buck, as it were, in terms of his proclamation of the gospel. And he had this strong inclination to go to Rome. And in fact, he does go there, although not quite under the circumstances he had envisioned. What takes place as this story unfolds is he does go to Macedonia, he does go to Corinth, and late in the year 57, and through the winter into 58, he spends, we'll read eventually, 3 months in Corinth. He stays at the home of a guy named Gaius, and there he is envisioning his trip to Rome, which is the next item really on his missionary agenda. Because he's there in Corinth thinking about Rome, he writes a letter to the Romans. And that little note that he scratches off during that 3 months becomes what we call the letter to the Romans, probably the most magnificent piece of theological work in the whole Bible. And he writes that, never having been to Rome, more or less a letter of introduction, wanting to clarify his own approach to the gospel, because, of course, a lot of rumors were circulating about Paul by this time. He's especially concerned about the Jew-Gentile conflict throughout the church, and particularly in the Roman church. And so that letter to the Romans is very important, and that's really coming up now pretty soon in terms of the unfolding story. So his interest in going to Rome will be preceded by the letter to the Romans that will take place even this year following Paul's story. Then he says, so we have verse 22, so he sent 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia, while he himself stayed for some time longer in Asia. Paul stays in Ephesus. This carries him into the year 57, so we're now going through the winter into 57. He'll stay there, we'll see in a minute, until Pentecost, which is the late spring of 57. But in advance of his journey to Macedonia, he sends these 2 trusted characters, Timothy, who we already are acquainted with. He comes from Lystra, you recall, picked him up on the second journey, and Erastus. We've never heard of Erastus before, but we learned from Paul that he is actually the city treasurer in the city of Corinth. And Paul makes reference to him when he writes his letter to the Romans. He makes reference, he's in Corinth at the time, to the city treasurer Erastus. So these 2 were with Paul. Apparently Erastus had taken a leave of absence and was there accompanying Paul in Ephesus for some time. And Paul, in a sense, commissions him, along with Timothy, to go up into Macedonia in advance of Paul. Why? Well, to put it bluntly, because Paul was fundraising. That's why. He was raising money. Now, he was raising money, and he didn't want to do all of the campaigning himself. So he sent these 2 in advance to let them know that Paul was coming, and hopefully to encourage them to do a little bit of prior work in terms of gathering some funds in advance of Paul's arrival. Now, the reason he was fundraising, and this shows up in details here and there through the story, especially in his letters, is because he was gathering money for what were called the poor saints in Jerusalem. Now, the poor saints in Jerusalem were poor because they had been booted out of the synagogue. These were Christian people, and because of their Christian faith, they had been frozen out of the synagogue, which is also tantamount to saying they were frozen out of the economy. They couldn't buy, they couldn't sell, they couldn't trade. They were, in a sense, disenfranchised from the culture, and they were plunged into radical poverty simply because of their faith. And so you had a kind of large subculture of Christian people who were impoverished because of their faith, and Paul will make frequent reference to their needs and will ask the Gentiles to gather funds to help the Jewish people there in Jerusalem. And he'll sort of set it up like a parody. He'll say, you, after all, have become beneficiaries of their spiritual contribution. You should in turn make contribution to them of your material wealth and help, you see. And he'll make that kind of argument in 2 Corinthians and elsewhere. So he's sending to the Macedonians, and he wants to give them a heads up that he's on his way, and that he's going to be asking for funds, and Timothy and Erastus are there kind of as the advanced warning of that. Erastus is certainly a good guy to do that because he was the city treasurer in Corinth. And thus he was a man who was accustomed to fiduciary responsibility. He would be trusted with taking care of the funds. And so all of this is kind of the interplay that's going on as Paul sends them off in advance of him to Macedonia. Then he stays for a while in Asia. Now I'd like to, with your permission, just do something a little bit unusual and skip over to 1 Corinthians. Keep your thumb right here. We're not leaving Acts for long. But this is about the time that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, right here, just at the tail end of his time in Ephesus. And just to see how these correlate, I'd like you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And I'd just like to read for you a few verses here. This is the tail end. Now, the 1 Corinthian letter, as you know, is actually the second letter he wrote to them. There's the severe letter that we don't have. And then this letter, which is fairly severe, called 1 Corinthians, we do have. He straightens out a lot of things that were going on in the church that were not really appropriate. But now at the tail end of this letter, chapter 16, picture Paul. He's in Ephesus. He's in the last 2 or 3 months in Ephesus. He has sent Timothy and Erastus off ahead of him. And now he writes these words to the Corinthians, you see, where he will eventually show up. Verse 16, or chapter 16, verse 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints, meaning the saints in Jerusalem, okay, you should follow the directions I gave to the churches in Galatia. Paul had come from Galatia some time before. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put aside and save whatever extra you earn, so that collections need not be made when I come. Paul was really not into strong-arm, money collection tactics. He wanted this all to be done in advance. And when I arrive, I will send any whom you approve with letters to take your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. I will visit you after passing through Macedonia. For I intend to pass through Macedonia, and perhaps I will stay with you or even spend the winter so that you may send me on my way wherever I go, which is exactly what happened. Paul is in Ephesus. He's planning to go through Macedonia, hoping to get to Corinth by the tail end of the year 57 and spend the winter. That seems to be exactly what happened, as Luke tells us later. Verse 7, I do not want to see you now just in passing. He could have jumped over and made a quick visit. He doesn't want to do that. For I hope to spend some time with you, if the Lord permits. But I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. Pentecost is late spring, April. He's probably writing this about January. So that he's envisioning maybe another 3 or 4 months there in Ephesus. For a wide door for effective work has opened to me, and there are many adversaries. So this is the great sort of paradox of the gospel. The hotter the kitchen gets, the more Paul likes it, you see. There's lots of opportunity, doors are wide open, and wow, are there a lot of enemies. And so Paul, that's his cup of tea. There are many adversaries. If Timothy comes, Paul was sending Timothy and Erastus ahead of him, see that he has nothing to fear among you, for he is doing the work of the Lord just as I am. It does seem odd that Paul will frequently appear to apologize for Timothy. And I'm not quite sure. There's speculation about that. Maybe it was just that Timothy was sort of a non-assuming, almost a shy kind of person. He seems to get a counsel from Paul in 1 and 2 Timothy along those lines. Whatever reasons, we have this interesting little word here. Don't despise him. Therefore, verse 11, let no one despise him. Send him on his way in peace, so that he may come to me, for I'm expecting him with the brothers. Now, concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to visit you with the other brothers, but he was not willing to come now. He will come when he has opportunity. Again, reading between the lines, you know Apollos went to Corinth while Paul was in Ephesus. He was there for some time. We get the impression Apollos left under not happy circumstances. We don't know this for sure, but it's sort of innuendo. Maybe it was because Apollos was troubled that people were forming an allegiance to Apollos and others forming an allegiance to Paul that was beginning to threaten to split that church, and Apollos would have none of it. And so he left, apparently, and Paul is saying, hey, Apollos, why don't you go with Timothy and Erastus and visit Corinth? And he's saying, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not ready to do that yet. Like Apollos himself was concerned about the impact on the church. Now, you grant, I'm doing a lot of kind of reading between the lines here, but some of this seems to sort of hang together and some of the underlying story that appears to be going on. So let's go back now to Acts, and we're at verse 23 of Acts 19. About that time, no little disturbance broke out concerning the way, hehodos. That was a standard reference to the church early on. The way, the people of the way. They were called people of the way before they were called Christians or the church or things like that. So this was, again, kind of an early way of referring to the Christian movement. A man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made little silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the artisans. The temple to Artemis was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was a huge and spectacular edifice that was located there in the city of Ephesus. And as you can probably imagine, there was considerable trade in the form of souvenirs and that sort of thing related to the temple of Artemis. One of the most popular souvenirs was a little box that was made out of silver and actually was a replication of that great temple. So it was like a miniature temple, you see. And people could come and buy this little temple, box, shrine, and they could take it home and put it on their shelf in their living room or wherever they kept their little pantheon of idols. Now, Artemis was, and the Roman name was Diana, was the Greek or Roman deity that was one of the 12 major deities of the ancient pantheon and was largely responsible for the notion of fertility. And so it was considered wise to have one of these little shrines in your home because that would make your home a fertile place. And Artemis herself was not particularly attractive. I'm not going to show you any pictures, but it was kind of grotesque, actually, but sort of a multi-breasted female deity there you go. Let your imagination take it from there. But anyway, she was quite popular, and so she had this huge temple there in the city of Ephesus. The myth was that Artemis, and I won't go into the whole mythological history, but there was this moment when apparently a meteorite hit the ground. That seems to be what was the beginning of this story. And of course, the ancients tended to be somewhat superstitious about such events. And this was conceived of as a statue of Artemis that had been thrown to the earth by Jove or by Jupiter or Zeus. And so this was regarded as a very holy object. It was probably just a rock, but they had taken either the rock or a part of it, or possibly even built the temple around it. That's not clear. And so in the very core of the temple was this holy object, which was presumably the statue that had come down from heaven, which represented Artemis. And so that's kind of the little story, the background behind what's alluded to here. So anyway, Demetrius is probably the president of the guild. In the ancient world, there were a lot of guilds. These are like trade unions, except they had somewhat more power. They usually had a religious overtone to them. There were many guilds centered in Thyatira. Some were elsewhere. There was a major guild then in Ephesus, and many, many people were associated with the manufacture of artifacts connected to Artemis, and they all had to be members of the guild. And Demetrius seems to be the president or some kind of ruler within the guild. So he summons a meeting of all the people who are part of the guild to discuss with them the problem that is evidently arising connected with Paul. So he's a silversmith. He brings together these others. They all realize quite a bit of revenue, of course, from this business, which is being jeopardized, apparently, by Paul's ministry. These he gathered together with the workers of the same trade and said, "Men, you know we get our wealth from this business." Demetrius is an honest man. He doesn't get, we're so concerned about Artemis, we don't want to besmirch her. He does touch that later, but the main thing he's concerned about is money. And he begins to see a little bit of an impact on the bottom line that seems to be connected to the ministry of Paul, and that's what perturbs him and provokes this interest. So the first thing he says cuts right to the chase. This is the issue. We get our wealth from this business. That's a given. Okay, we all grant. We'll buy off on that proposition. Now, point 2 of the speech. You also see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost the whole of Asia, referring to Asia Minor, the western coast of Turkey, this Paul has persuaded and drawn away a considerable number of people by saying that gods made with hands are not gods. So point 2 of Demetrius' speech is Paul is a problem, because he seems to be teaching people things that are inconsistent with what is at the very heart of our own religious scheme. That these little shrines we're making, the great goddess Artemis and all of this, are not gods. And so Paul apparently is a problem, which we wouldn't be too concerned about but for the fact that through all of Asia, he's beginning to have some traction here. There's beginning to be a certain amount of, movement to follow him. This region of Asia, apparently there were several churches founded about this time, and Paul may have visited many of them. You may recall the book of Revelation is addressed to the 7 churches of Asia, of which Ephesus is one. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. And there's a couple of others. Colossae was around that region. Hierapolis was in that region, and certain others. And so apparently, Paul or those sent by Paul had established churches in many of these cities, and it seems that all of them were doing reasonably well. And you get enough people beginning to fall off the wagon of idolatry and fall into the wagon of worshiping Christ, and you begin to see the old revenue chart taking a little dip there. And that's what had Demetrius concerned. So all of this region appears to have been somewhat significantly impacted then by Paul and his ministry over this 2-year period of time. Quite a remarkable tribute not only to Paul, but obviously to the impact and effect of the gospel. Verse 27, and there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but now, see finally, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be scorned, and she will be deprived of her majesty, poor dear, and that brought all Asia to the world to worship her. You would think a god could take care of herself. Wouldn't you think that? What kind of deity is it that can't preserve her own majesty? She's a deity, for Pete's sake. Paul's just a guy. And yet somehow Demetrius doesn't address that point, but is just concerned that her great honor is going to be besmirched because of the effect that is following from the work of Paul here. And so finally the religious concern shows up. Number one is money in Demetrius' speech. Number two is a reference to Paul and the effect that he's having. Number three is the religious concern that Artemis herself may suffer some kind of negative effect there as a result of the work of Paul. So, that's the speech. Well, when they heard this, they were enraged and shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." This was a kind of liturgy that was associated with Artemis. This wasn't just something they spontaneously erupted, in saying, but this was actually kind of a little chant that was common in connection with the worship of Artemis. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So these guys fall into line. The knee-jerk reaction to this speech is to just fall back to the basic announcement that would be made at this point. And it's kind of a rallying cry here. So they begin to shout this. And as a result of that, verse 29, the city was filled with confusion, and people rushed together to the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, who were Paul's travel companions. The city was filled with confusion, and the people rushed to the theater. I imagine probably some of you have had the opportunity to visit Ephesus, which is really remarkably well preserved. Candy and I had the chance to be there about 9 years ago, and it's an amazing city. It was vacated almost overnight. I may have mentioned this. Pardon me if I said this. I sometimes forget what I said. But the city was vacated almost overnight in about the year 130 or 40 because of a malaria outbreak. This is A.D. And so they just left everything, just head for the hills. And the whole city then just filled with silt that comes down from the Pactimus River. And so the city was just basically buried in silt. And then gradually the silt created a moving shoreline so that eventually Ephesus was there not on a seashore, but really in dry land, but covered with silt. And so now, a couple of thousand years later, archaeologists are over there digging it up, and they find the city basically in the same condition it was at the time that Paul was there carrying on his ministry. The streets of Ephesus are made of marble. Marble was very common in that region. Granite was considered more precious than marble. But they had lots of marble, so they paved the streets with marble. The wonderful, just wide streets. And if you go down to the city square, there's a huge library on one side, and there's some other evidence of businesses that were operating there. But not far from the city square is a kind of huge theater. Amphitheater, really. It's shaped something like a football field. There's seats all around the edges, sort of like a football field, really. It's oval in shape, and the field wouldn't be quite as large as a football field, but not far from it. It could accommodate several thousand people, and that's manifestly where this took place, this event that we're reading of here. So all of these people resort to the amphitheater, which is the kind of the place of public gathering, and there they carry on the story that we're reading of here. So the people rushed into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus. Gaius is probably the Gaius that Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians, who was his host during the 3 months that he was in Corinth. It's probably from the home of Gaius that Paul writes the book of Romans. And so he shows up more than once. Aristarchus, we don't know much about him, except that he does show up several times. Paul mentions him probably 5 or 6 times in subsequent writings. And he's always mentioned in very positive, glowing terms. He's the one guy, or at least one of the few, who stood by Paul through thick and thin. Even when Paul was in prison, Aristarchus was there. When others abandoned Paul, they just couldn't stand it. Too much tension, too much pressure. Aristarchus was with him. So this guy Aristarchus was probably a wonderful guy and a great encouragement, and he makes his first appearance in the book of Acts right now. So he's drug into the theater along with Gaius. They couldn't find Paul, and what's going to happen to them is an open question at this point. Verse 30. Paul wished to go into the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some officials of the province of Asia, who were friendly to Paul, sent him a message urging him not to venture into the theater. Paul loves a party, and all these people are having a party, and he wanted to go because he thought this would be a great chance to preach the gospel. What greater opportunity when you have all these people gathered, and of all things, they're gathered and rioting over the very issue of Paul and his ministry. So he thought this was, this was the perfect opportunity. But saner, cooler heads prevailed and said, Paul, don't go there. Paul at least was at this point willing to listen to these counselors. He doesn't always do that, Later, in fact, in the next chapter, we're going to find Paul heading for Jerusalem, setting his face as a flint to go to Jerusalem, as it were. And everybody was saying, Paul, don't go to Jerusalem. And Paul said, I'm going to Jerusalem. They couldn't talk him out of it. But this time they were able to dissuade him from that plan. So not only the disciples, but also those whom Luke here refers to as officials of the province of Asia. The word that Luke here uses is Asiarchs. That's actually a legitimate term describing the 10 rulers, Roman rulers, who governed the Roman province of Asia. And so he's using a technically correct term. And it seems as if some of these were actually biased toward Paul, possibly believers, that's not clear, but in any event, not hostile to him, possibly simply concerned about protecting order. For whatever reasons, they also join in the counsel to Paul, urging him not to go into that den of lions. Verse 32, meanwhile, some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Typical mob. Most of the people showed up because it was just action and commotion, and they were curious, but they didn't necessarily know what the cause of all of this was. Some of the crowd gave instructions to Alexander, whom the Jews had pushed forward, and Alexander motioned for silence and tried to make a defense before the people. It's an enigmatic verse. The Greek doesn't help us a whole lot here. The translations vary as to what exactly is going on. I think the best approach to this is something on these lines. There was at least some perception that what was causing this riot was a reaction to the Jewish population, because, of course, they did not recognize Artemis. They lived in their own subculture religiously, and while they were generally tolerated, they weren't popular. But now that we have this popular uprising in defense of Artemis, at least some people were assuming that the Jews were at the heart of the problem, and so possibly the Jewish people were pushing Alexander forward to make a defense. It's not us. We're not the ones at fault. It's those lousy Christians, you see. That may have been what was intended here, but it's not clear. I'll just leave it at that. That, I think, is the best attempt to construe that verse. Verse 34, but when they recognized that he, that is Alexander, was a Jew, for about 2 hours all of them shouted in unison, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" Over and over and over. A liturgical chant in this riot kind of setting. Now, this isn't strictly on point. I'm going to drop down to a little footnote comment to our discussion here to simply make this note. Many religions in the world adopt a religious practice of recitation. Jesus, you may recall, warns, don't just idly, vainly repeat words, thinking that your many words are scoring points with heaven. He says the Gentiles do that. The pagan world practices religion that way, but that is not the way it is with Christians. The driving rationale behind that recitation, whether it's, Om, or whether it's Great as Artemis of the Ephesians, or whether it's some other kind of chant, is actually the plan there is to try to vacate the mind, to try to empty the mind of rational cognitive process. The theory is that the mind is an impediment to worship. And so whether it's the Dionysian cult that wanted to intoxicate the mind into sort of non-functionality, or whether it's reciting something or some other means, the intention here is to make the mind shut down. And the belief is that if the mind gets out of the way, then some kind of sub-rational aspect of you can connect with the deity. Okay? That's a very common pagan approach. It is not Christian. And so whenever you hear, and I hear it more than I would like to within the Christian world, the mind is the problem. Don't think so much. Kind of a hostility to being intellectual, a hostility to being academic, a hostility to using your mind, and in the name of Christ saying you should set your mind aside and somehow in a sort of mystic and sub-rational way contact God in a mindless sort of technique. That's not Christian. That's not in the Bible. That's not the way we're called to worship God. Certainly our experience of God is greater than the mind, but it's not less than the mind. And those kinds of religious techniques that say the mind is a problem to set aside, I think are getting off onto a very unhealthy track. It's okay for the pagans. If they want to worship mindlessly, fine, let them. But we Christians must do better. We are to engage and use our minds at the highest possible level of discipline. And so at this point, let's not be confused with what the Ephesians were doing here. So anyway, into footnote, just kind of threw that in there at the bottom. Let's jump back to the text now. But when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, and now he sort of reports the obvious to these people, look, citizens of Ephesus, who is there that does not know that the city of Ephesus, of the Ephesians, is the temple keeper of the great Artemis and the statue that fell from heaven? This is common knowledge. So you people here having this huge rally, as if you're saying something new or not saying anything new. Everybody knows what you were announcing at this point. So at that point, chill out. Since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. The city clerk here was actually otherwise called the city secretary. Was a Roman official, not a law enforcement officer, but did represent Roman authority. And one of the principal purposes of this office holder was to make sure that orderliness generally was maintained in the city. The Romans loved order. They loved it. And anything that looked like chaos, tumultuous outbursts, commotion, riot, the Romans were pretty fierce in their reaction against that. And the city clerk is getting a little worried now that he has this crowd that's been gathering and chanting and all of this for a couple hours, so that obviously is what's concerning him. You've brought these men here who are neither temple robbers nor blasphemers of our goddess. We haven't caught them pilfering or invading or vandalizing the property of the goddess Artemis, nor have they been blaspheming her. It is not the same thing for Paul to preach that we should worship the one true God and that the gods made with hands are truly not gods. That's a very different thing from blaspheming, which would be a kind of open and vulgar assault on the religion, the alternative religion and those who practice it. Paul doesn't do that. He's certainly critical of it, but it doesn't rise to a level that would be called blasphemy. If therefore Demetrius and the artisans with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, there are proconsuls, let them bring their charges. Obviously, he's just remarking the obvious once again that, if there is a legitimate complaint, a lawsuit can be filed, remedies can be sought, damages can be paid. But at this point, you're way out of line to be kind of almost falling off the edge here in this kind of riotous behavior. If there is anything further you want to know, it must be settled in the regular assembly. Interesting term, the Greek word there, regular assembly, is the word ekklesia. It's the word that we translate church. And just a side point here, you may be interested in knowing that when the New Testament community was going to adopt a word to describe its own organizational community, it chose a word. It didn't invent the word, but it chose a word out of the pagan culture, which essentially was the word for something like a town meeting, an assembly. And so it uses a word that has some meaning on the street and simply says that, when Christian people get together, it is in a sense a town meeting. It's an open meeting. It's a meeting in which anyone can come, but it's a meeting that is principally to gather together in the worship of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so it is, in that sense, a town meeting of a much higher significance. But it's the same word that that was used by the town clerk here. It'll be settled in the regular assembly, namely the ecclesia. We are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there's no cause we can give to justify this commotion. And when he had said this, he dismissed the assembly. And so that's the end of our discussion of the riot. Paul will make a comment later about the fact that he fought wild beasts in Ephesus. He says that, in fact, in 1 Corinthians. He makes that comment in chapter 15. And it may very well be that he's describing not wild beasts as such, which was highly unlikely, but rather was talking about the human wild beasts that were attacking him and assaulting him. That's a possibility. All right. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Our Father, we're grateful that you have given to us this opportunity to continue reviewing the life of the great apostle. We thank you for the wonderful testimony it was to the power of the gospel, that even the most entrenched and powerful commercial enterprise felt the pinch as the gospel of Christ was disseminated through that region. We thank you that while the goddess Artemis has not survived, Christ has. And that he continues to reign and that he continues to be our King and the King of this world and of the universe. And we honor and praise him this morning and give you thanks for this time together in his name.